One cold winter night, a 16-year-old girl named Brittany Snow was home alone, watching TV. Her parents had gone out to a dinner party at a friend's house. It had been snowing heavily all afternoon, but Brittany felt nice and snug as she sat on the sofa in the lounge, tucked up under a warm, fuzzy blanket. By midnight, Brittany's parents were still not home, and she began to feel uneasy. She didn't want to call them in case they thought that she couldn't take care of herself. The television was in the corner of the room right next to the big bay window. She was watching one of her favorite movies, a horror film named Prom Night, when suddenly out of the corner of her eye she noticed something moving in the bay window. Through the darkness and the falling snow, she could make out the figure of a man, walking towards the window. As he got closer, she was able to make out his face, and it filled her with horror. The man's face was hideously scarred. His eyes were wild and crazy, and he seemed to be grinning maliciously at her. Frightened, Brittany pulled the fuzzy blanket over her head and tried to hide. She hardly dared to move. Slowly, she pulled the blanket aside just enough to peer out with one eye. The man was still standing there. He was just standing there, staring directly at her as the snow fell behind him. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something. It was a long knife. Terrified, Brittany pulled the blanket back over her head and hoped that the madman would think it was just a pile of blankets sitting on the sofa. She managed to move her hand slowly over to her pocket and took out her cell phone. Pressing the buttons in a panic, she dialed 911 and held her breath as she waited for an answer. When the operator asked, "What's your emergency?" Brittany put the phone close to her face and whispered, "There's a man outside my window. He's got a knife. Please come quickly." She sat motionless under the blanket as the minutes ticked by. Eventually, she heard sirens outside and the police started banging on her front door. Brittany pulled the blanket and rushed to the front door, letting the two police officers inside. They said they had not seen any trace of anyone outside her house. "He was right there," said Brittany, pointing out the bay window to the snow-covered front lawn. "That's not possible," said the female officer. "There couldn't have been anyone standing out there. The snow was completely undisturbed. If someone was out there, they would have left footprints." "But he was standing right there, staring straight at me," said Brittany. "I saw him with my own two eyes." "You know, your eyes can play tricks on you," said the male officer. "Maybe you've been watching too many scary movies." The officers turned to leave when all of a sudden the female officer stopped dead in her tracks. She pulled back the sofa that Brittany had been sitting on. Her jaw dropped as her eyes widened in shock. Brittany and the male police officer gasped. On the carpet behind the sofa, there was a trail of wet footprints and a discarded knife. "You weren't looking at the man outside the window," said the female officer. "You were looking at his reflection. He was standing right behind you all along." When Mr. Smith eventually came home, it was extremely late. He closed the front door very quietly, took off his coat and scarf and hung them up on the stand. Then he just stood in the hallway, breathing heavily. In the bathroom, he spent a long time scrubbing his hands and nails. Finally, he turned off the light and went to bed. The next morning, he woke up and went downstairs to the kitchen where his wife was cooking breakfast. "What time did you get home last night?" asked Mrs. Smith. "Oh, about 1 o'clock, her husband replied as he picked up the newspaper and flipped through it. "Well, it must have been later than that," she said. "Maybe it was 1:30, he replied. "It couldn't have been 1:30, said his daughter as she came into the kitchen and sat down. "My boyfriend dropped me home from the disco at 2:30 and Dad still wasn't home." "What's the matter, Dad? You look very pale this morning." Mr. Smith didn't reply. He pretended to read his newspaper. "I didn't get much sleep last night," said his wife. "I had such a terrible nightmare. I dreamt you were executed." Mr. Smith knocked over his coffee cup and it spilled all over the table. "Because of a murder," his wife continued. "In the middle of the night. It was so vivid." "Wow, Mom, that's crazy," cried his daughter with glee. "Who'd he murder? Tell us all the grisly details." "Well, it was really grisly," said her mother. "It was Daddy's boss, Mr. Browning." "What?" asked her husband. "In the nightmare you murdered poor Mr. Browning," said his wife, "because he caught you stealing money from the company." "How'd he do it, Mom?" His daughter laughed. "Go on, tell us." "Be quiet," said her father. "Dreams are a load of nonsense." "I want to hear it," his daughter giggled. "Well, it was late at night," said his wife, "and Daddy was giving Mr. Browning a ride home from work. They were chatting about business and they were arguing, and Daddy stopped the car in the middle of nowhere. Daddy said he had to get something, and he got into the back of the car." "Go on," said Mr. Smith. "Let's hear it then." "Well, your coat and scarves were on the back seat, and Mr. Browning was still sitting in the front, and you picked up a scarf, and while you were talking to him, all of a sudden you just put it around his neck and strangled him." "Really? That's just silly," said Mr. Smith. "It was silly," said his wife, "but in my dream it seemed so real. I was so upset. And that wasn't the end of it. You dragged him out of the car and dumped his body by the side of the road, like he was a piece of old rubbish, and the scarf was still tied tightly around his neck." "Good heavens," said Mr. Smith. "It sounds just like a movie," said his daughter. "It was so vivid," said his wife. "You wouldn't believe how vivid it was. I saw you put your coat and scarf back on, and then it all got mixed up. You know how that happens sometimes in dreams. And then you were being questioned by the police, and they brought you down to the police station. And you were still wearing a coat and scarf, only, seeing it by daylight, it wasn't your scarf. Your scarf is blue. It was a red scarf. It was Mr. Browning's scarf." "What do you think of that, Dad?" His daughter laughed. Mr. Smith began buttering his toast nervously. "Very strange," he said. "It's silly, of course," said his wife. "I just thought I would tell you." "Maybe it's not as so silly," said her husband. "In fact, I did give my boss a ride home from work last night. We had a very serious talk. Not to go into details, but he was acting very strange. Maybe it was later than I thought when we got home. He told me to stop the car and he got out in the middle of nowhere. When I left him, I had the most horrible feeling. It's dangerous on these deserted country roads. You don't know what kind of madman you might cross paths with. I hope nothing's happened to him." "You don't think he's been in some accident or something?" asked his wife. "I hope not," said her husband, "but these days you never know what you're going to run into." "Good morning, Mom," cried his son as he burst into the room. "Morning, Dad. I'd better get going or I'll be late for school. It's cold outside today. Who owns this scarf, by the way? It's not yours, is it, Dad? Yours is blue. This one is red. Can I take it?" Mr. Smith took one look at the red scarf and put his head in his hands. "What's the matter?" asked his son. "Did I say something wrong?" Just then, the doorbell rang. There was a teenage girl who was hired to babysit 2 young children. After the parents left, she put the children to bed and then went downstairs to watch TV. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from the basement. It was the washing machine starting up. She was about to go and turn it off, but when she opened the basement door, the noise stopped. Shrugging her shoulders, she returned to the living room and resumed watching TV. 5 minutes later, she heard the washing machine start up again. She got up, opened the basement door, and started walking down the steps. She had only gone down a few steps when the noise stopped again. She went back to watch TV. 5 minutes later, she heard the washing machine yet again. Worried, she went upstairs, gathered the children, and ran over to the neighbor's house to call the police. They arrived a few minutes later and went down to search the basement. They found a man armed with an axe hiding behind the washing machine. He had been trying to lure the babysitter down to the basement in order to kill her. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you'd like to, you can follow me at Twitter. The handle is @FuzzyPantaloons, and I'll see you all next time.